Alright class, so here's an example of how to do a screencast. You can see my culminating assignment is of mice and men, and I've included my first name on the first slide. Next I'm going to click to slide number 2, and there I'm going to introduce my thesis. In analyzing of mice and men, one of the major ideas or motifs that comes up is prejudice. And in this novella by John Steinbeck, prejudice is used to separate and emphasize the apartness or the differences of characters. Steinbeck reinforces this theme through the use of 3 characters: Crooks, who faces a specific form of prejudice called racism; Curly's wife, who faces sexism; and Candy, who faces ageism and ableism. For our first example, I'm going to talk about Crooks. Crooks is perhaps the most obvious example of prejudice in the story, and the prejudice he faces is racism. For example, on page 68, "Why ain't you wanted?" Lenny asked. "'Cause I'm black. They play cards in there, but I can't play because I'm black." Indeed, Crooks is correct. The racial epitaph used to describe Crooks, the N-word, is used throughout the book and is used pervasively. And this stereotype is used to make Crooks seem less like a person and more of a stereotype. He has no identity. He has no personality. He, to a certain extent, has no humanity or even feelings. And it's only after this in-depth conversation with Lenny, if you can call any conversation with Lenny an in-depth one, that we start to understand just how pervasive the racism Crooks faces is, and how it has left him basically without an identity. And because of this, Crooks is really left to himself, and that is a very lonely place for him to be. The second example I'm going to talk about is the sexism. Sexism is another, again, specific example of prejudice. And this time, we're going to talk about Curly's wife and the fact that she faces sexism. In fact, maybe the most obvious example of this is that Curly's wife is not given a name throughout the story. On page 51, "She ain't concealing nothing. I never seen anybody like her. She's gonna make a mess. She's jailbait. Range ain't no place for a girl, especially like her." This is a quote from George, and George treats Curly's wife as though she is a harlot. She has no other identity other than basically a sexual identity. She is also, by her very name, Curly's property. She belongs to Curly, and her only identity is as his wife. And at various times, Curly's wife is referred to as a Lulu, tart, rat trap, and, as in this quote, jailbait. Any power she has is due to her looks and sexuality. But even in this, Steinbeck turns this against Curly's wife, as there's an implication that she is sexually promiscuous, and because of this, she loses any power from that. The third and final example I want to talk about is Candy and the ageism and ableism that he faces. Ageism is an example of prejudice for people who are either overly young or overly old. In Candy's case, overly old. And ableism would have to do with people who suffer from disabilities. Candy. In describing Candy, Curly's wife says, "All right, and what am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs and a lousy old sheep." Candy is the lousy old sheep that she's talking about. Candy has lost his hand, and he is prescribed doing a very simple manual job. His job is to wash out the bunkhouse and the wash house, and that's it. His lack of ability to do things is emphasized by the old dog that follows him around, just like him. Grizzled, moth-eaten coat. He's beaten down and on his last legs. And it's because of this that, of course, Carlson goes and shoots Candy's dog. Candy is not as able as the other men. He doesn't have a hand, and he's old. And because of that, he's another example of how character faces prejudice. He's not seen as having as much value as other able-bodied or younger characters. Indeed, in a different part of the book, Candy even offers just to do chicken stuff, quote, for George and Lenny when they start talking about the little place that they want to dream of their own. So in conclusion, we can see that there are many examples of prejudice in John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. He focuses in on 3 specific examples of prejudice: the racism that Crooks faces, the sexism that Curly's wife faces, and for Candy, it's the ageism and ableism that he faces as well. And that's how you make a screencast.